what did I do there? I don't know what I did. Hang on. There we go. I have no idea what I did. Oh, you got to be smarter than the computer, don't you? Well, welcome back, folks, to our journey through the soundtrack of our youth. We are looking at the early years of 1950 and 1960. Not concentrating on rock and roll, but there's a lot of it because that's the era that rock and roll came out. But there was also lots of good country music and adult contemporary music, soul music, rhythm and blues. We're covering the whole gamut of that. So, as always, let us get into this by listening to a little Bob Seger here. Whoop, and I just went past it. Well, I don't guess we will listen to Bob Seger today. Well, trivia question. What doo-wop group released a string of good-humored storytelling hits that in the late 1950s and 60s were so successful that the group became the first group inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Well, if you guessed the Coasters, then you were right. The Coasters rose to fame in the late 1950s after releasing a string of hits, a lot of them written by Leiber and Stoller, those guys that wrote Hound Dog and some of the other early Elvis Presley songs, and later just wrote a ton of songs. I think they ended up having 81 charters in their career. But they wrote for the Coasters, they wrote Yakety Yak, little novelty song called Charlie Brown, Poison Ivy, Along Came Joan, Little Egypt. They just had a lot of what were kind of called novelty songs. So I thought we would listen to the Coasters sing probably the one song that they're most noted for, Yakety Yak, and also a little bit of Charlie Brown.
The founder of the Coasters is one of my favorite people in the world of music. Carl is no longer performing, but his legacy lives on through his son, Carl Gardner Jr. Here are the clown princes of rock and roll, Carl Gardner's Coasters.
Take out the papers and the trash. Are you looking for spinning cash? If you don't scrub that kitchen floor, you ain't gonna rock and roll no more. Yakety yak.
Don't throw it back.
Just finish cleaning up your room. I see that just fine with that room. Get all that garbage out of sight. Or you don't go out Friday night. Yakety yak.
Don't throw it back.
You just put on your coat and hat and slip on down to the laundry mat. And when you finish doing that, bring in the dog and put out the cat. Yakety yak.
Don't throw it back.
Well, let's go a little further and see if you remember this next song. Beep-beep-bop-bop-bo-bo-bum. I smell smoke in the auditorium. Charlie Brown, Charlie Brown, he's a clown. That Charlie Brown, he's gonna get caught. Just you wait and see.
Why is everybody always picking on me?
Let's see him on his knees. I know that it's him. You're the seven, come 11 now. He's the boy, you, Charlie Brown, Charlie Brown, he's a clown. That Charlie Brown, he's gonna get caught. Just you wait and see.
Why is everybody always picking on me?
Okay, well, enough of that. Review. Let's look at what we looked at last week. Last week we saw how the Big Bopper, became famous for his song Chantilly Lace, and Richie Valens, who became famous for La Bamba, were both on the cusp of being big stars. I mean, they had just released their two biggest songs right before the end of 1958, and of course, if you know anything about music history, you know that they were involved in that that airplane crash that resulted in their premature death, along with Buddy Holly in January of 1959, which became known as the day the music died. Really a big event in early music history. We also looked at the Platters. They just kept on turning out hits, and their hits were primarily, a lot of them were just remakes of old standards that they kind of did in their own individual style, but they really appealed to the young listeners of the era. We saw how a group called Little Anthony and the Imperials broke out in 1958 and just really became one of the big groups of the 50s and early 60s, and are still going today. Little Anthony is still alive, as are two of the original members that sang with him. Only one of them are gone, and they're still out there singing their songs in their 80s, and apparently doing a good job of it. We also saw how a young man by the name of Cliff Richard, that was his stage name, became the first homegrown rock and roll star. He was the first one to start writing rock and roll songs in England. There had been another guy, Tommy Steele, but he covered songs from America. Cliff Richard actually started writing songs, and he kind of started what became known as the Mercy beat, which ended up resulting in a few little acts like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and some of those acts that became very famous in the 1960s in what was the so-called British invasion. And then we saw how the record producers were just really trying to find that next Elvis. They really wanted to find the next guy to emulate Elvis, since Elvis was in the army and no one knew for sure if he was ever going to be able to come back like he had. They settled on a young man by the name of Conway Twitty, and he did sound like Elvis. In fact, if you listen to Conway Twitty early on in his career and close your eyes and don't look at him, you actually think you're listening to Elvis. A lot of people did when they heard him on the radio. The problem was Conway Twitty didn't want to be a rock and roll star. He wanted to be a country music star. And he just kind of rebelled against everything they did. And of course, went on to have just a gigantic country music career. So let's listen to one of the big songs of 1958, which was not rock and roll. The Chordettes. They had already had a big hit in 1955, Mr. Sandman. We played that early on. Well, they followed that up in 1958 with another song called Lollipop, which kind of is on the verge of being a novelty song. But it was it's a really cute little song. By the way, there's a guy in here that does the lollipop sound. See if you can recognize him.
Lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop.
Boom, boom, boom.
Lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop.
Boom, 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 boom.
Oh, my baby lollipop, tell you why. His kiss is sweeter than an apple pie. And when he does the shaky rock and dance, man, I haven't got a chance. I call him lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop, lollipop, oh, lolly, 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 lollipop. Sweeter than candy on a stick.
Okay, I'm sure some of you recognized Andy Williams there. Andy Williams did the little lollipop sound there. Now, remember, 1958 was a year that the record companies were trying to move on from rock and roll. They didn't want to completely do away with it because they realized that they had a group of young baby boomers here, teens that were buying records by the droves. But what they wanted to do with music was move it into what they called good music. So they started experimenting. Some of it was pretty good. Some of it was just pretty bad. I'll be honest with you. One of the trends that they started was instrumental songs. Now, instrumental songs weren't new by any means at all, but they were kind of new in rock and roll. There really hadn't been that many instrumental songs in rock and roll. And they began experimenting and trying to find people to play like guitar solos or group solos. Probably the first one was a man by the name of Bill Justice, who actually was the musical arrangers at Sun Studios for Sam Phillips. And he was quite an accomplished musician. He had written a song called Raunchy, which, didn't exactly sit too well with some of the moms and dads. They didn't particularly like that name. Pretty good song, though. Went on and to become the kind of first rock and roll instrumental hit, sold over 1 million records. And it kind of started a trend that kind of continued on. For instance, in 1958, you had 3 instrumental songs that would hit the top 10, which had not happened before in rock and roll. The first one was by the Champs, a little song called Tequila. Again, probably didn't set too well with certain groups of people. And then we had a song called Rumble by Link Ray. A lot of people don't know about Rumble. I'm sure a lot of people remember Raunchy and Tequila and the third one there, Rebel Rouser, but a lot of people don't remember Link Ray and Rumble. It was a British song, and it really would have a future impact upon what is now called heavy metal in the 70s and 80s. And it was kind of setting kind of a song about a rumble, which was a fight between gangs. And it's a good song, but it didn't exactly hit too well on the airwaves. And then, of course, there was the big one, which was Rebel Rouser by Duane Eddy. Duane Eddy just was a phenomenal guitarist, and he wrote this song. And it just is one of those songs that just, you just keep it in your mind. You can hear it. And mainly because it has such a unique chords type thing. He also wrote a lot of other things. He wrote Peter Gunn, the theme for Peter Gunn, Moving and Grooving, because they were young, and eventually became a really big record producer and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on his own. But here is Duane Eddy playing his big song, Rebel Rouser, and this was at the 2013 Americana Awards, and he's still going. He's still out there playing Rebel Rouser. You can maybe catch him at fairs or something. So here he is. Okay, so there was Duane Eddy playing his famous song, Rebel Rouser. Now, another kind of trend that hit in 1958 was a kind of an unusual amount of what we would call one-hit wonders. Now, there've been one-hit wonders ever since there's been music. People will record a song and it'll become kind of big, and that's it. But it seemed like 1958 really started a trend of several one-hit wonders in music, pop music. Uh, it just seemed like one of those years that it really started off, and it would follow up. There'd be one-hit wonders for several years in a row here. Some of them pretty big. For instance, the Monotones had a record called The Book of Love, and I'm sure some of you remember that. We just listened to the Chordettes. Really not a one-hit wonder. They'd had another hit, Mr. Sandman, but still kind of on that realm. There was a song called To Know Him Is to Love Him by a little group called the Teddy Bears, the only song they ever recorded. What's unusual about it is that the guy who wrote it and was involved in a trio was Phil Spector, who later on became just a giant in the music industry as a producer and created what became known as the Wall of Sound. We'll hear a lot more about Phil Spector when we get into the 60s. And then there was a crazy little song called Boney Maroney. And, I know they used it for a commercial not too many years ago. But without a doubt, the biggest one-hit wonder of 1958 was a song called Rockin' Robin, recorded originally by a guy by the name of Bobby Day. Went on the chart at number 2 on the Billboard chart, number 1 on the R&B chart. And folks, this is one of those songs that just won't die. I mean, people keep recording it. You keep hearing it. Michael Jackson had one of his first biggest hits with the Jackson 5 of Rockin' Robin, sold over 1 million records in the 70s. And if you watch any TV now, you've probably seen a Cinex commercial where you got a couple driving up to the pumps to pump gas, and they're both listening to Rockin' Robin, and they start kind of tweeting at each other. It's kind of it's a real cute commercial. It's one of those songs that won't die. People and it's almost like an earwig. You hear it, and then you start playing it in your mind for the rest of the day. And every time I hear this song, I have a hard time getting it out of my mind. It's an infectious little melody. So here is Bobby Day, the original singer of Rockin' Robin.
Bobby Day and his very, very big hit national record of Rockin' Robin. Here it is. He rocks in the treetop all the day long, bopping and a bopping and a singing his song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, tweet, tweet. Rockin' Robin, tweet, tweet, rockin' Robin, tweet, tweet. Slow rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. Every little swallow, every chickadee, every little bird in the tall oak tree. The wise or loud, the big black crow, flap of their wings, sing and go, birds go. Rockin' Robin, sweet, sweet, rockin' Robin, sweet, sweet. Slow rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. Sweet love. A pretty little raven at the birdman's stand, taught him how to do the bop, and it was grand. He started going steady and bless my soul. He out-bopped the buzzard and the Oreo. He rocked in the treetop all the day long, hopping and a bopping and singing his song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, tweet, tweet. Rockin' Robin, rock, rock, rockin' Robin. We'll go rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. Say, well, a pretty little raven at the birdman's stand, taught him how to do the bop, and he was when started going steady and bless my soul. He out-bopped the buzzard and the Oreo. He rocked in the streets all the day long, hopping and a bopping and a singing his song. All the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, tweet, tweet. Rockin' Robin, tweet, tweet, rockin' Robin, tweet. slow rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight.
Okay, if any of you have trouble going to sleep tonight because you got that earwig Rockin' Robin in your head, don't blame me. I'm sorry. It's just one of those songs that once it gets in your head, it's kind of hard to get out of your head for a while. Well, as I said, 1958 was this era of good music. Well, some of it wasn't so good, folks. It seemed like 1958 produced an inordinate amount of novelty songs. Some of them weren't too bad. Some of them were just downright horrible. A lot of them were really big sellers for whatever reason. Kids really liked them. I guess because one reason they were just kind of silly. And, kids are silly, let's admit it. But there were just really a bunch of them. For instance, David Seville had a song called The Witch Doctor. I bet you remember it. Charlie, the Coasters. We've just talked about the Coasters and listened to Yakety Yak and Charlie Brown. They had 3 novelty songs in 1958, all of them big sellers. And then there was a David Seville again who came up with this chipmunk song thing. And again, the chipmunks just won't die. They make cartoon shows about them. They have movies about them. And they just irritate the daylights out of me. I can't hardly stand to listen to one of them, but people loved them. And then there was a song by Sheb Wooley. Sheb Wooley was actually a TV actor of quite renown. He was in Rawhide. He was in a lot of really big TV shows. He came up with one of the silliest songs I think that's ever been written called The Purple People Eater. And again, it's one of those songs that if you listen to it, it just kind of sticks in your head. So I'm not going to play it because I don't want to be going to bed tonight listening to Purple People Eater in my head. Kind of on the realm of novelty songs, which is actually a pretty good song, was the Battle of New Orleans. It's kind of a historic novelty song. And it was recorded by Johnny Horton, and he had a whole string of these, Sink the Bismarck, several. And he had a lot of big songs going there for a couple of years. Unfortunately, he got killed in a car wreck and, didn't last. But without a doubt, the absolute biggest of the novelty songs of 58, which is also probably one of the worst songs ever written and recorded in the history of music, was something called Kooky Kooky Lend Me Your Comb. I'll bet you some of you out there remember 77 Sunset Strip. It starred several big names, but one of the side characters was a guy by the name of Edward Burns, who went by the name of Kooky on the show. And he was kind of a mixture of a Jack Kerouac's on the road beat type person, kind of a young James Dean, kind of set the mold later on for Fonzie on Happy Days. Well, Eddie Burns decided he wanted to be a recording star. And so they decided to hook him up with a girl by the name of Connie Stevens, who was also on a show called Hawaiian Eye at the same time. And they were both real popular as teen idols. And they decided they would record a song called Kooky Kooky Lend Me Your Comb. And this thing sold over 1 million records, became a big hit. And I swear it's one of the worst songs you will ever hear in your life. But for that reason, I got to play it. Okay, so here is Ed Burns and Connie Stevens singing, if you can call it that, Kooky Kooky Lend Me Your Comb.
Here is a young man and a young lady. Here now. Who do you ask, how do you know what's going to happen? He is one of the stars of 77 Sunset Strip. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Burns.
Cookie, cookie, lend me your comb. Cookie, cookie.
Well, now, let's take it from the top. Grass the wheels. Well, I was talking about them cuckoo deals.
But cookie, cookie.
I'm reading you just fine. Don't cut out of here till we get on cloud 9.
But Cookie, Cookie,
I've got smog in my noggin ever since you made the scene.
you're the utmost.
If you ever tune me out, Dad, I'm the saddest, like I'm green.
The very utmost. Cookie, lend me your comb. Cookie, Cookie,
Man, I got my furnace lighted and my flaps are gonna bend. You're gonna send me to that planet called, you know it, baby, the end.
Cookie, Cookie, lend me your comb. Cookie, Cookie,
If you ever cut out, then I'd be a stray cat. But when I'm flying solo, nowhere's where I'm at.
Cookie, Cookie, lend me your comb. Cookie, Cookie,
What's with this comb caper, baby? Why do you want to latch onto my comb?
I just want you to stop combing your hair and kiss me. You're the maximum utmost.
Well, I'm beamed in on Dreamville and I'm moving right now. Cause that's the kind of scene that I dig. Baby, you're a ginchy.
Hey, Ed, Connie, come on.
Okay. Maybe not the worst song ever written, but it's got to be in the top 10. But again, that shows you the depths that the record companies went to sell a record, because that thing again sold over 1 million records, hit number 1 on the charts. Just unbelievable to me. Well, let's switch over to country music and finish up 1958. Country music was kind of going through a transition itself. While pop music was going through the era of good music, country music was beginning to go through something called creation of the Nashville sound. They were kind of starting to get away from the twangy, nasal type songs. They were beginning to record some pretty good songs with orchestras and backup singers, and they were getting rid of the fiddles and the steel guitars, and they were just beginning to record some fairly decent songs. Some of them weren't. There were still plenty of those out there. For instance, let's look at some of the top 10 songs of 1958. Stop the World and Let Me Off by Johnny and Jack. Later on became a big hit for Eddie Arnold. Another one was Geisha Girl by Hank Locklin, not anything real great. One of the greats, I Can't Stop Loving You, which was written by Don Gibson, but recorded originally by Kitty Wells, and later on by Ray Charles and Elvis Presley, and just a ton of people. Just one of the great songs that ever came out of country music. Blue Boy by Jim Reeves. Along With You by Farron Young. Blue Blue Day by Don Gibson, another song by Don Gibson. That was a big song. Send Me the Pillow That You Dream On by Hank Locklin, really good song. City Lights by Ray Price, really was one of the first real what you call Nashville sound songs. And Just Married by Marty Robbins, and the biggest hit in country music of 1958 was Oh Lonesome Me by Don Gibson. We'll hear that in a second. Let's look at Ray Price. Ray Price was one of those guys that just really blossomed in the 50s. He had just a ton of really big hits in his career up to about 1970, and then he kind of semi-retired. Release Me, Crazy Arms, Heartaches by the Number, For the Good Times, The Nightlife. For the Good Times was written by Chris Christopherson, Nightlife written by Willie Nelson. Both of them just super great songs. He was raised in Dallas, near Dallas, Texas, and had wanted to be a veterinarian. Went to World War II, served in the Pacific Theater with the Marine Corps, got back, and I don't know if he'd just seen too much violence and what all, but he decided he didn't want to be a vet anymore. He wanted to be a singer. And he had just a beautiful voice. I mean, his voice is really, really good, and particularly late in his career when he was singing songs like For the Good Times and The Nightlife. I mean, he just really, was a a serious singer, considered one of the best voices in country music. He also roomed for a brief time with Hank Williams back early on in his career. His first band, look at who was in his first band. I mean, just unbelievable. Roger Miller, Willie Nelson, Johnny Paycheck, all when they were unknown guitarist and instrumentalists singing and playing in his band. Became, like I said, one of the first real Nashville sound singers, which we're going to hear more about later on. Semi-retired in 1970, would come out of a retirement on occasion, probably mostly for singing along with Willie Nelson, who was a good friend of his, and wrote, like I said, some of his songs like The Nightlife. Unfortunately, he passed away, pancreatic cancer, but not before he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. This is one of his big early songs, Heartaches by the Number. So let's listen to Ray Price.
Heartache number one was when you left me. I never knew that I could hurt this way. And heartache number two was when you come back again. You came back and never meant to stay. Now I've got heartaches by the number, troubles by the score. Every day you love me less, each day I love you more. Yes, I've got heartaches by the number, a love that I can't win. But the day that I stop counting, that's the day my world will end. Heartache number three was when you called me and said that you was coming back to stay. With hopeful heart I waited for your knock on the door. I waited, but you must have lost your way. Now I've got heartaches by the number, troubles by the score. Every day you love me less, each day I love you more. Yes, I've got heartaches by the number, a love that I can't win. But the day that I stop counting, that's the day my world will end. Thank you.
Okay, one of the great voices of country music. And like I said, if we get a chance, we'll hear Ray Price later on when he was singing some of his really great songs in the more Nashville sound, like in the good times. I mean, it's really just a phenomenal voice. Well, let's talk a little bit about Don Gibson. Don Gibson isn't as well known as a singer as he is as a songwriter. In fact, I'm not for sure there's ever been a better songwriter in country music than Don Gibson. He just had a knack for it. Born real poor, Shelby County, North Carolina, dropped out of school in the second grade, helped out at the farm, as a lot of kids did back in those days. Began singing on a local radio station with a group called the Sons of the Soil, and had such a good voice. And like I said, he just seemed to have a knack for songwriting. Got hired by Knoxville, Tennessee radio station, and it was here that he really became a songwriter. Just look at some of the songs that he wrote. He wrote Sweet Dreams, which was one of the first great hits for Patsy Cline. The initial success of that song earned him a contract for songwriting by Roy Acuff, who was just gigantic in Nashville. moved to Nashville. Afternoon in 1957, he said he was sitting alone in his trailer park and just had one of those days when he was kind of sad and lonely, and sit down and wrote 2 songs within the span of an hour. Folks, those 2 songs were, one of them was "Oh Lonesome Me," and the other one was "I Can't Stop Loving You." 2 of the greatest country music songs that's ever been written. And I mean, he wrote these within an hour. And it's unbelievable how one man could do that. Of course, "I Can't Stop Loving You," like I said, it had just been recorded by practically everybody in the world that's ever sung a song. Ray Charles maybe had the biggest hit with it. We'll hear Ray Charles singing that a little bit later. Some of his songs were written, they were kind of sad, and a lot of them were about solitude and being alone. And so he kind of got the nickname of the sad poet of country music. Again, just like Ray Price, he was one of the early participants in the new Nashville sound that was starting in the late 50s. Unfortunately, like a lot of these people, he kind of got messed up for a while with alcohol and drugs, but then he cleaned up and had a resurgence in his career for quite some time, and ended up being inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Died the age of, I believe, 75, living still at home in Shelby, North Carolina, where he came from. So here is one of his great hits, "Oh Lonesome Me." Remember, he wrote this and "I Can't Stop Loving You" within an hour of each other. Really amazing.
Oh, lonesome me.
Everybody's going out and having fun. I'm just a fool for staying home and having none. I can't get over how she set me free. Oh, lonesome me. A bad mistake I'm making by just hanging around. I know that I should have some fun and paint the town. A lovesick fool that's blind and just can't see. Oh, lonesome me. I bet she's not like me. She's out and fancy free, flirting with the boys with all her charms. But I still love her so, and brother, don't you know, I'd welcome her right back here in my arms. Well, there must be some way I can lose these lonesome blues. Forget about the past and find somebody new. I've thought of everything from A to Z. Oh, lonesome me. Well, I bet she's not like me. She's out and fancy free, flirting with the boys with all her charms. But I still love her so, and brother, don't you know, I'd welcome her right back here in my arms. Well, there must be some way I can lose these lonesome blues. Forget about the past and find somebody new. I've thought of everything from A to Z. Oh, lonesome me. Oh, lonesome me.
Okay, great song, and like I said, we will hear his other really big song. He had a lot of them, but his other one, "I Can't Stop Loving You," we'll hear that when Ray Charles sings it here in a few years. So that's it for 1958. We're going to move on next week to 1959, the day the music died. A lot of people that are really into very early rock and roll things that 1959 was the last year of rock and roll. Now, I don't necessarily believe that, but a lot of people do. But we're going to hear what happened in 1959. We'll take the year just like we have the other years and look at some of the events and some of the songs and all the different genres. And see what transpired. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Our little walk down memory lane. And tonight, if you can't get to sleep listening to Rockin' Robin, don't blame me. Well, I guess you can. So that's it for today. Thank you. Goodbye.